Welcome, everybody, to the River Falls Public Library. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Tanya Misselt. I'm the director of the River Falls Public Library. I want to also mention that the Library Foundation pays for all of our programs here at the River Falls Public Library, and I'd like to thank them for bringing these opportunities to us. Our presentation tonight is obviously in person for those who are sitting here, but it's also on Facebook Live, and it's being recorded on YouTube. So we have a kind of a varied audience here. We do have time at the end for questions. If you have questions, we will make sure you get a chance to ask them, and we'll also invite our virtual audience to post questions online, and we'll work to get to those. I do want to thank everybody for wearing your mask, but when we get to the point where you're talking, if you ask a question, please take off your mask and speak loudly so our visitors online can also hear your questions. So I'm thrilled to introduce to you my new friend, Dr. Christopher Lehman. Dr. Lehman is a professor of ethnic studies at St. Cloud State University in St. Cloud, Minnesota. He is a member of the Phi Beta Kappa, and he was a visiting fellow at Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. His work has appeared in the Minnesota History magazine, and his latest book, Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State, won the 2020 Minnesota Book Award for Minnesota's nonfiction category. Please welcome Dr. Lehman.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to the River Falls Public Library for inviting me for speaking tonight. Thanks to all of you who are here in person, and thanks to all of you who are watching whenever you're watching. I'm not originally from Minnesota. I was raised in Oklahoma, and I went to Oklahoma State University for my undergraduate years, and I went to the University of Massachusetts for graduate school. And as soon as I received my doctorate in 2002, I had a job waiting for me at St. Cloud State University. So I am halfway through my 20th year at St. Cloud State. And during my first year at St. Cloud State, one of my acquaintances who was African American was giving a speech. And at the end of the speech, when it was time for questions or comments, one of the people in the audience, who was about middle-aged, 40s, 50s, and European American or white, said to my friend that St. Cloud, Minnesota was just fine before you people came along. And when this person said this, or rather when my friend told me about this person saying this, I was still new to St. Cloud, so I didn't know anything about the history of St. Cloud. And based on this person making the comment being middle-aged, I figured, well, perhaps this person is saying that people of color only came to St. Cloud starting in the 1950s or 1960s. So just to make sure, I went to the Stearns County, Minnesota Historical Society, to their library, and I only had to open one book to find out that African Americans did not come to St. Cloud in the 1960s, but rather in the 1850s. And they came as enslaved people. And it was that last part that especially struck me, because not being from Minnesota, not being from the Northwest, I had only heard about Minnesota historically as being a place that was either a free territory or a free state. And in either capacity, legally speaking, there's not supposed to be any slavery. So I was surprised to find out that there was, and that it was enough of a known fact for a local historian to put it in a history book. So I wanted to just learn more about slavery being in Minnesota in the first place. So what I would do over the next decade or so in my spare time is to see if I could find in the census records names of people who live in Minnesota but were born in the South. And then I would go to earlier censuses, say from 1860 or 1850, and see if those same Southerners are in the censuses for their home states, and if they're listed as slaveholders, or if they're listed as enslaved people. So I did this for about a decade until, for the first time in my research, I came across a person who was listed in 1860 as living in St. Paul, Minnesota. But that same year, there was a census slave schedule coming from the slave state of Maryland. And for those of you who don't know, a slave schedule is the part of the census that recorded the presence of enslaved people. But unlike the regular census, the slave schedule did not record enslaved people by name, only by the hash mark, the age, the sex or gender, and the color. And since there wasn't really a whole lot of variation with color, it would either be B for black or Y for yellow, which was to mean a European American parent and an African American parent, or M, which back then stood for mulatto, which meant the same thing as yellow. So this person was listed as a resident of St. Paul in 1860, but also in the Maryland slave schedule as the owner of a woman. And I'd never come across someone who was listed in two separate censuses, essentially, from two different states in the same year. So I did some research on that person whose name was Harwood Iglehart. And apparently he was a big deal in St. Paul. He had invested in real estate, and he developed quite a few streets in St. Paul in the Payne-Phelan neighborhood, where if you go to St. Paul and you go to that neighborhood and you come across streets that are named after southern flowers like magnolia and hyacinth, ivy, jessamine, those come from Harwood Iglehart. So does Maryland Avenue, and so does Iglehart Avenue. But when I learned about Iglehart being involved in real estate and coming from the South to buy land in Minnesota, number one, that got me to thinking, well, who else from the South did that? And number two, if I could find the real estate deeds, those deeds would be this concrete paper trail that shows that money exchanged hands from a Southern slaveholder, and therefore a plantation or farm that enslaved people worked on, into the hands of a Minnesotan. And wherever that Minnesotan lived, money from slavery became part of that local economy because of whatever businesses that Minnesotan decided to invest in while in Minnesota. I had said earlier that I had this idea that Minnesota had always been free, but in the process of doing my research, I found out that that wasn't true at all, because there actually was a brief period of 14 months when slavery was actually legal in Minnesota. Now, most people who are raised in Minnesota know about Dred Scott and how he and his wife Harriet Scott sued for their freedom because they had been taken by their owner, who was a military officer from the slave state of Missouri and the base Jefferson Barracks, all the way up to Fort Snelling in Minnesota. And legally speaking, they should have been freed the moment that they were in Fort Snelling, but they stayed enslaved, and the officer took them back down to the South when his deployment in Fort Snelling was over. So when the Scots sued for their freedom, it wasn't out of nowhere because there had already been at least two people who had sued in the slave state of Missouri for their freedom after having already been to Fort Snelling and Fort Crawford in Wisconsin. And they were both women, and they both won. First, there was a woman named Rachel, who I believe won her case in 1836. And then a woman named Courtney the following year won in 1837. And even though they both sued for their freedom in Missouri courts, and Missouri judges presided over the case, and the judges were slaveholders, they respected the law. And at the time, there were two federal laws on the books. There was the Northwest Ordinance, which said that all the land that is in Northwest Territory, which includes now Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, and the part of Minnesota that's east of the Mississippi River, is supposed to be free. And then there's the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which takes care of the rest of Minnesota, the land to the west of the river, and what constituted Louisiana Territory back then. So with those two laws in the books, the Northwest Ordinance and the Missouri Compromise, there's not supposed to be any slavery in this part of the country. And the slaveholding judges in Missouri said, that's the law, so you two ladies are free. So it seemed like a slam dunk case for the Scots. But by the time their case reached the Supreme Court, the tide had politically changed. For one thing, there was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which said that if there's a fugitive slave hiding in a free territory or a free state, the owner has every right to go to that free area, catch their fugitive, and bring that person back. And if you in the North are harboring this fugitive or helping the fugitive to hide from the enslaver, then you yourself could face criminal charges. So really, there isn't anywhere in the United States where African Americans can live comfortably in their freedom, at least in the places where there are free states and territories. So then there's that. And then in 1854, 4 years later, the KansasNebraska Act is passed. And even though there was the Missouri Compromise and the Northwest Ordinance, which said that anything to the north of the geographic parallel 3630 was supposed to be free, the KansasNebraska Act said that Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory, both of which were above that parallel, could decide for themselves if they wanted slavery or not when they became states. So since it wasn't a given that land to the north was automatically free, there were some people in Minnesota who thought that the KansasNebraska Act applied to them too, that it applied to Minnesota. So by the time you get to the Dred Scott decision 3 years later, in 1857, that pretty much confirms what some Minnesotans had thought about the KansasNebraska Act, that there is no such thing as free territory. Under the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court said that any territory was open to slavery, that the Missouri Compromise and the Northwest Ordinance were essentially invalid after 1857. And at the time, Minnesota was still a territory. It was not yet a state. It wouldn't become a state until May of 1858. So for those 14 months, from March of 1857 to May of 1858, slavery was legal in Minnesota. In my research for the book, I did not find any evidence of people selling people in Minnesota during those 14 months. But there definitely was an uptick in Southern travel. There were definitely more Southerners who came to vacation in Minnesota in the summer of 1857 and bring their enslaved people with them because legally they could, and they didn't have to worry about anybody in Minnesota making them free their slaves while they were on Minnesota soil. So I was really struck by that, and I wanted to make sure that I made 1857 a focal point in various chapters of the book where the transition from being a free territory to a slave territory made a difference. Speaking of Fort Snelling, one of the things that I learned from reading another book when I first got here, actually 10 years after I got here, it's a really good book by Walt Bachman called Northern Slave Black Dakota. And it's about Joseph Godfrey, who was the son of the woman Courtney, who sued for her freedom. Now, when Courtney sued for her freedom in Missouri, her owner had separated her from the son that she had given birth to in Minnesota. So when she sued in Missouri, she could only sue for herself because her son was still in Minnesota. And he eventually ran away from his owner in Minnesota and settled with the Dakota people. So by the time he got to the Dakota War of 1862, Joseph Godfrey is fighting with the Dakota against the same army that had made him and his mother enslaved. But the system that Rachel and Courtney were in, and that Dred Scott was in, was a system in which the U.S. Army had completely invalidated the two anti-slavery laws that were on the books. I tell my students all the time that a law doesn't amount to a hill of beans unless it's enforced. And those two laws were deliberately not enforced by the Army. It was not an accident. So when Fort Snelling was completed in the 1820s, the Army needed military officers to staff the fort. And some of the officers that the Army wanted to send there were, again, from the slave state of Missouri at Jefferson Barracks. And judging from how many people came in today with coats on, you know that it gets really cold here in the winter. And if you're from the South and you're accustomed to the warmth, you might not be all that crazy about having to go to Fort Snelling. So the Army said, you know what? I hear you. So if you want to bring one of your slaves with you to Fort Snelling, you can do that. Don't worry about the law. It's okay. We'll even give you a stipend to help you pay for the care of the slave that you're not supposed to have at the fort. So the military officers who came with their slaves were getting paid by the government to break the government's own law, if that makes any sense. And this was a long time thing. It started in 1825, and I've found records going up to as late as 1860, the year before the Civil War, when the government is still giving allowances to people from St. Louis coming to Fort Snelling with one or two servants, which was the colloquial way of saying slaves in the North. So that's discussed in Chapter 1. But what's discussed in even more detail in Chapter 1 is the people that the Army is guarding in Minnesota at the time. And those are largely fur traders, people who we would consider to be Minnesota's founding fathers, people like Henry Sibley, Henry Rice, people essentially who have cities and counties named after them in Minnesota. Well, these people worked for the American Fur Company, and they were in charge of different trading posts that were all over Minnesota. But the people whom they worked for were people who were all the way in the slave state of Missouri. They were business partners who were part of the firm, or who made up the firm, Choteau and Company. And the three partners were all slaveholders. They were Pierre Choteau Jr., John Sanford, who would become one of the owners of Dred Scott. He's the Sanford of Dred Scott versus Sanford. And the third person was John Sarpy. And it's with John Sarpy that I was very surprised that I had a personal connection to the book. I had no idea about that at all when I was writing the book. And it was only after I had completed my last revision and I had looked through the proofs and I said to my editor, that's it, I'm done. Go ahead and get the book printed. That's when I found out, when I was doing my regular hobby of my family tree, that there was someone connected to the book who had enslaved my fifth great grandmother, a woman named Veronica. who I thought had lived her whole life in Louisiana, but apparently had spent some time in St. Louis. So she had been sold by a man named Sylvester Labadie to another man named Zenon Trudeau in 1792. So when I saw that name, Sylvester Labadie, I thought, why does this name sound familiar? Labadie, Labadie, Labadie. And then for some reason, I went to the proofs of my book that I had already approved. And there on page 17 was Labadie's name because he was the grandfather of John Sarpy, one of the partners of Choteau and Company. So I don't know how it would have changed the book if I had known that. In a way, I suppose I'm glad I didn't know at the time that I wrote, because it allows me to be a little bit more detached from the material than to just present it more matter-of-factly. But again, there were 3 slaveholders who were the partners of Choteau and Company, and Choteau and Company owned American fur from the early 1840s until all the partners died by 1865. And for a while, they kept up with the fur trade, but after the fur trade started to go down in the 1850s, they switched to real estate. And towards the end of chapter 1, I talk about the holdings that Choteau and Company had in Minnesota. On page 28, it says, in the 1850s and 1860s, Pierre Choteau Jr. owned real estate in several locations throughout Minnesota, many of them having come from his management of American fur. Most of his land was in the cities of Hastings and St. Paul. His former employee, Norman Kitson, had facilitated the acquisition of the majority of the property in St. Paul, and that portion was named Kitson's Addition. Just outside the city lay Choteau's 160 acres by White Bear Lake, an additional property by Pig's Eye Lake. In southern Minnesota, he owned more than 100 lots in St. Anthony, 25 lots in Belle Plaine, and land in Washington County and at Traverse des Sioux. He also invested considerably in central Minnesota, possessing almost 150 lots in Sauk Rapids and 2 lots in Lower St. Cloud. In the meantime, he remained a slaveholder, keeping captive at least 5 slaves in St. Louis. So again, chapter 1 is about the military officers at Fort Snelling and about the fur traders that they guarded and the slaveholders in St. Louis who employed them. Now, starting with chapter 2, I get more into the involvement of the U.S. government beyond the Army. I was just talking to my students about this today because as a professor, I have the prerogative of lecturing out of my own book. And so we talked about how politics back in the 1850s is not really that different from politics now. When it comes to people whom the President of the United States appoints for different positions, presidents tend to appoint people who have similar politics as theirs. And this was certainly the case in Minnesota. Now, for most of the time that Minnesota was a territory, the presidents in the White House were part of the Democratic Party. And one of my guilty pleasures, which is not so much a pleasure anymore, is that I read comments on Twitter. I don't know why I shouldn't, but I do. And one of the things that I read a lot when people talk about skin color on Twitter, or they talk about politics and geography and inequality, is something along the lines of African Americans should be more conservative because Democrats love slavery. And it's just not that simple. It's not that cut and dry. So politics in the 1850s was like this. If you were a Democrat, that meant that you approved of slavery being in the slave states where it already existed, and you approved of it expanding into the territories. Now, if you were on the opposite end of that, if you were a Republican, or if you were before that a Whig, that meant that you supported slavery being in the slave states where it already was, but you didn't want it to expand. It was just fine within the confines of where it was already legally established. Now, there were some radical Republicans who just did not want slavery at all, the abolitionists. But they were very much the minority of the party, and mainstream Republicans, did not want them to have too much power because slavery was such a volatile issue. In fact, radical Republicans were derisively nicknamed Black Republicans, even though there were no African American office holders back then. But it implied that by being anti-slavery, Republicans wanted to favor African Americans above everybody else. So that's why they were Black Republicans. But again, Democrats wanted slavery to expand. Republicans just wanted to keep it where it was. Now, there was Franklin Pierce, who was president from 1853 to 1857, and James Buchanan, who was president from 1857 to 1861. And they appointed people who matched their politics, which included, at times, appointing slaveholders to different positions. In the years that Minnesota was a territory, the people of Minnesota did not elect their own governor or lieutenant governor. The president chose those people. And in 1853, President Franklin Pierce chose a slaveholder from Virginia named Joseph Travis Rosser to be the lieutenant governor of Minnesota. So we have this very ironic position of an active slaveholder being one heartbeat away from governing a free territory. And he was a very staunch Southerner. Even while he was the lieutenant governor of Minnesota, he was very openly and very proudly pro-South. And so much so that if anyone spoke negatively about the South, he would beat them up. Page 39. On March 6, 1857, the Minnesota legislature was in the penultimate day of its legislative session when the federal government legalized slavery in the territory. The Supreme Court ruled in Dred Scott versus Sanford that the practice was legal in all federal territories. The verdict intensified the debate over slavery among Minnesotans. In May, Rosser and local abolitionist Morton Smith Wilkinson were discussing Southern rights, according to a Virginia-based newspaper. But the discussion escalated into an argument and then a fist fight. Rosser won the fight, and the paper heralded his victory with the headline, "Defending the South." So again, you have the lieutenant governor of a free state beating up an abolitionist and a newspaper in the South celebrating the victory. Such was politics in Minnesota back then. But he was the highest ranking slaveholder in Minnesota's government. Thankfully, Pierce and Buchanan never appointed slaveholders to be the actual governor. However, during the few times that Pierce's appointment for governor was out of town, or out of state rather, on business, whenever he was out of state, then Rosser temporarily became the governor of Minnesota. And I was able to find a couple of instances where Rosser was signing off on documents for Minnesota territory as governor. So those politics had consequences. If they weren't serving as lieutenant governors, then they were serving in county offices, either as tax collectors for the country or as the official land registers whenever there was a transaction taking place. And there were quite a few slaveholders who served in those two different offices in counties throughout Minnesota. Where I'm from in Stearns County, for example, both positions were held by slaveholders at the same time. James Buchanan appointed another Virginian slaveholder named Sam Hayes to be the tax collector, and he appointed William Carruthers to be the land register. Now, I should say that Carruthers actually was not a slaveholder. He was the nephew of a slaveholder, and his uncle had purchased over like thousands of dollars in land in 1856. So when Buchanan won the election that year, as sort of a reward to Carruthers' uncle, Carruthers was appointed by the president to be the land register for Stearns County. Similarly, Sam Hayes was a very supportive delegate for Buchanan during his campaign. Hayes had already been in Congress in the 1840s. He was actually the person who had given a recommendation to a young man by the name of Thomas Jackson to go to West Point. And he later became Stonewall Jackson during the Civil War. So that's Hayes' claim to fame in Virginia, pretty much. But when Hayes came to Minnesota in 1857, he was one of the few people who brought a mother and daughter who were enslaved with him. And they stayed with him for the whole time that he was in office in Minnesota. Outside of Stearns County, there's another person who geographically had consequences for Minnesota. He was appointed from Alabama for a federal position in Otter Tail County, Minnesota. And his name was George Clitheroe. And he is believed to have held one of his slaves in Minnesota during the time that he was in office. And he went back to Alabama when it was almost time for the Confederate States to secede and for the Civil War to begin. In fact, pretty much all the Southerners, or almost all the Southerners who were in Minnesota for what they thought was a permanent period, left when the Civil War broke out. But Clitheroe had made such an impression that there are, to this day, 2 places in Minnesota that are named after him. There's Lake Clitheroe, and there is the city of Clitheroe, both of which I believe are in Otter Tail County. So chapter 2 is about the presidential appointees. Chapter 3 and chapter 4 and chapter 5 talk specifically about the Southerners who came to Minnesota on their own, people who were not appointed by the president or who were sent by the army, but they came because they just wanted to come here. Chapter 3 focuses on the people who left everything behind in the South to live in Minnesota full time. But what that meant was, especially since they came before 1857, was that they had to leave all their ties to slavery behind. And I was able to find a couple of examples of people who sold all of the slaves that they had in order to have the money to buy land when they came to Minnesota. And one of those people came from Louisiana. And the ad for the sale of their people was in the newspaper a few months before they arrived, on page 62. Before departing Louisiana for good, Philip Garrig sold his plantation and slaves. A newspaper advertisement noted, "The attention of persons desiring Negroes and lands is directed to the advertisement elsewhere of Phil Garrig, Esquire. His place is handsomely situated, and his fruit trees are of the best species." In an additional notice from Garrig himself, he announced, "I will sell at public auction in the town of Baton Rouge at the courthouse door on the 14th of February next at 11 o'clock a.m. a likely lot," which meant a promising lot, "of Creole slaves as follows: 5 women, 2 men, and 5 children. Also 1 tract of land containing 320 arpents. Also an undivided tract of land containing 640 acres. He then established the terms of the sale. The slaves and land, 1/3 cash. The balance in 1 and 2 years from day of sale with good endorsed notes, and a mortgage retained until final payment. Persons desirous to purchase in block the slaves or land can see me at my Amity plantation previous to the day of sale. So, after having had this auction and sold his slaves, he went to Scott County, Minnesota, and he invested primarily in the town of Shakopee. And Clitheroe also invested in Scott County, and there was another family, a family from Virginia, and they invested in the town of Belle Plaine. And they had also sold off their slaves before they left Virginia and came to Belle Plaine, Minnesota. Chapter 4 is about the richest of the planters who left and came to Minnesota, although not all of them stayed permanently in Minnesota. Some of them came just to buy the land, and then they went back home to the South because they wanted to diversify their portfolios. There were a lot of places in the South where growing cotton and growing tobacco constantly was just depleting the richness of the soil. So they didn't want to have all their eggs in one basket, monetarily speaking. So they felt that investing in land in the West was a good way to remain financially solvent. One of the things that I'm proudest of as a researcher is finding something that I know no one else had ever found before, and that is a couple of advertisements that are back to back on page 90 of my book. They're both from a man named Robert Dyson, who was from Maryland. And the newspaper is a newspaper from the state of Maryland. But the top ad is of him announcing that he has a new real estate office in Minneapolis. And then the bottom ad is him saying that the next time he's back in town in Maryland, he has a woman he wants to sell. So I have never seen in print someone claiming to have a Minnesota address and being an active slaveholder. So the moment I found that, I knew that I had to take a lot of pictures of it and make sure that I had a good digital copy to send to my editor and say, put this in my book. So when you see that on page 90, know that that is an original image from yours truly. And it's a very powerful one, I think. I wrote the book and I'm still getting chills looking at it. And that's actually in chapter 5 of the book, which is about commuters. I tell my students that the concept of the snowbird is not a new one. And back in the 1850s and early 1860s, there were people from the South who came to Minnesota for long-term vacations, like from April all the way to September, because they had the money to do that. And sometimes they would just be here for the vacation. Others would be here to conduct business. One of the people that I write about is a man named Thomas Winston, who lived most of the time in New Orleans, but every spring and summer he would conduct land transactions in Minnesota. He would also invest in businesses. One of the places that he invested in was an insurance company that later became Travelers Insurance today. Now, chapters 6 and 7 begin to talk about Minnesotans, the people who do the recruiting of slaveholders to come to Minnesota and buy real estate. Chapter 6 is specifically about Henry Rice. Rice was one of the employees of American Fur, and so having worked for slaveholders, he knew about how wealthy slaveholders were and how much money they could bring to Minnesota. Also, he married a slaveholder. Well, technically, he married the daughter of a slaveholder. And I was mentioning this to my class today as well, that back then, for men who wanted to, as people say, marry up, socially speaking or economically speaking. One way to marry up was to marry a woman who either was set to inherit a lot of slaves when her father died, or a woman who had already inherited slaves because her father or previous husband had died. So that's what Henry Rice did. He married the daughter of a planter. And although he was not an active slaveholder, her father certainly was during the Rice's marriage. His wife's family was based in Virginia, and when Rice became a congressman in 1853, he became well-versed in land in Virginia and Washington, D.C. In fact, he co-owned some real estate in Washington, D.C. with a slaveholder, John Breckinridge, who was James Buchanan's vice president. One of the things that I discovered in Slavery's Reach, or in the research for Slavery's Reach, was that there was a tie that the University of Minnesota has with slavery, and it's because of Henry Rice. When Henry Rice became a congressman, he was actually a delegate because Minnesota was a territory, and delegates did not have voting power on bills, but they could still represent the territory. But even though Rice was a delegate, he could still meet his new colleagues in Congress, and he got along famously with the Southern ones, especially the slaveholders. And one of his colleagues was a man from South Carolina by the name of William Aitkin, and he held somewhere between 700 and 800 people on his plantation called Jehosi in South Carolina. And Rice invited him to invest in Minnesota. So in the summer of 1856, Aitkin came to Minnesota, and he saw the U of M. And at the time, the University of Minnesota had been shut down. It had opened for the first time in 1851, but it closed in 1854. So when Aitkin saw the university, it had been shut down for 2 years. Aitkin decided on the spot to loan $15,000 to the university. And that would be $250,000 in today's money. But again, if you enslave 700 people, you have that kind of money because your enslaved workforce is so massive and they're producing this labor that's generating all this capital for you. So he loaned the money, and by 1858, the U of M was up and running again. In 1857, Aitkin cashed out half his loan, so he took out $7,000, but that still left the U of M with $8,000, and Rice recruited the daughter of another slaveholder to replenish the missing $7,000. Her name was Isabel Cal, and she lived in Washington, D.C. One of Henry Rice's proteges at American Fur was a man named Sylvanus Lowry. And Lowry has an interesting history. He was originally from the South, from Kentucky, and his father was appointed by President Andrew Jackson to be the missionary for the Ho-Chunk Nation. So in 1833 or so, the Lowry family moved from Kentucky to Wisconsin because that's where the Ho-Chunk were. And as the federal government kept pushing the Ho-Chunk further and further to the west, the Lowrys went with them. Finally, Lowry's father retired, went back to the South, to Tennessee. But Sylvanus Lowry was an adult by then, and he had become wealthy from the fur trade. So he stayed. And with his money, he bought the northern 1/3 of St. Cloud. And I believe that was in 1855. The following year, St. Cloud became an incorporated city, and Lowry became the first mayor. That same year, he decided that he wanted people to buy his land. So he asked his father's colleagues in the ministry in Tennessee to come up to St. Cloud and buy land from him. And they did. And Lowry made a good $12,000 just in the summer of 1856 alone. Again, about $250,000. In 1857, he took ill and left the country temporarily, but he asked his brother-in-law, a man named Thomas Calhoun, to watch his house for him. So Lowry's brother-in-law and sister and their kids and a very pregnant enslaved woman come from Tennessee to St. Cloud. And the woman gives birth to her son in August of 1857, which is very important because August of 1857 is only 5 months after the Dred Scott decision. And it's another half year, at least, before Minnesota becomes a free state. So this baby is born at a time when slavery is legal in Minnesota. But then Minnesota becomes a free state. So what does Lowry's brother-in-law do? He doesn't free them in Minnesota officially. And really, he doesn't have to, because he would have only legally had to free his slaves if he had knowingly or deliberately brought them to a free state. That's not what happened. Instead, he had brought them to a slave territory that became a free state on him. So he was legally within his right to take the mother and baby back down to Tennessee and sell them. And that's what he did. It is the only time that I've been able to find in which someone who was born in Minnesota was taken to the South in slavery. But again, he was born a slave. Back then, the law was that whatever the status of the mother was, the status of the baby was. It didn't matter if the father was a free person. It didn't matter if the father was white or if the father was even a master. If the mother's the slave, the baby's a slave. So since the mother was definitely a slave in Minnesota in August 1857, so was that slave. So was that baby, excuse me. That's not to say that St. Cloud was without its critics. One of the few instances that I found of some kind of violence taking place in relation to slavery in Minnesota was during that same summer of 1857, when slavery was legal. I found a news report of someone wanting to run away from the hotel where his master was staying. And the runaway was able to get help from some local people to leave the hotel. But whatever accounted for law enforcement at the time came out, and they squashed the attempt, caught the runaway, and brought the runaway back to the owner. And what I tell my students is that, this being during the time that Dred Scott was legal, the police had to do that because the police officers, they don't make laws. Their only job is to enforce the law. They don't have to like the law. They just have to enforce it. So if the law is that Minnesota protects the rights of slaveholders, then you as the police have to do that. So that's why there was a slave riot of sorts in Stearns County in 1857 that resulted in the police taking the slave back to the master. Then chapter 8 talks more about the business side, about different businesses that were involved in some of the transactions of land between Southerners and Minnesotans. There were insurance companies, people who were employed by insurance companies that had policies out for enslaved people, especially enslaved people in transit. So let's say that you have an enslaved person and you trust that enslaved person enough to let him go work on a steamboat that goes all over the South. But let's say something happens to that slave, that perhaps he falls overboard and drowns or gets seasick and dies. Regardless, not only have you lost a slave, but you have lost a significant financial investment. But fortunately, since you took out an insurance policy on that slave, that covers your loss. So, people who insured slaves, some of them were involved in these transactions. There were also people who were involved in banks, people who gave loans to planters who were actively holding slaves. Then we get to chapter 9, which is specifically about the people who came here for vacation. There were people who came again during the spring and summer months. And after Minnesota becomes a free state, people in Minnesota decide that they're not going to pay attention to the law because there had just been this big influx of slaveholders the year before when slavery was legal. So the rationale that Minnesotans had was, if you slaveholders want to bring one or two slaves with you to the hotels, that's fine. We won't make you free them because we like your business. We like having a thriving tourist economy in the communities by the Mississippi River. And so that's what happened. And there were no strong, free African-American communities to speak of. So there wasn't anybody free in Minnesota who could help enslaved people who crossed the border into free Minnesota. There wasn't even a mechanism for people to get free papers to at least have that documentation. And then you have to consider that the one or two people who were chosen had a lot of family and friends that they were leaving behind for months at a time in the South. So when September rolls around and the vacation's over for the master, and it's time for the enslavers to go back home, the slaves always go back with them. But then the Minnesotans say, well, see, they're choosing to go back. It's their own fault. So that's how they rationalized their behavior. What begins to change the tide, number one, is in 1860, Minnesota elects a Republican for governor, Alexander Ramsey. And Southerners are just having a fit because they're worried that with a Republican governor, Southerners are going to be too scared to come to Minnesota. So in 1860, there were two bills that were introduced to the Minnesota legislature, one in the House and one in the Minnesota Senate. And the bill asked for slavery to be legal only in the tourism months and only for the tourists. Both of those bills failed, but they did not fail unanimously. And Chapter 9 talks about how many people voted for both of those bills. And it just goes to show you how invested Minnesota was in slavery that they were willing to undermine their own free state policy just to keep the money flowing from the tourists. Then the Civil War breaks out, and there is no tourist clientele because Southerners are too busy in the South defending the South. One of the ramifications of that is that people who used to be their clients are now in enemy states, including William Aitkin, who is in South Carolina. And at the time, Minnesota still owes Aitkin $8,000 from the loan, but now they don't want to pay back someone who lives in a Confederate state. So the Minnesota legislature says, well, you don't have to. In 1862, the Minnesota legislature passed what's called the Rebellion Act, which says that if you live in a Confederate state, you cannot come to Minnesota and sue in its courts. So if Aitkin wanted his money back, he can't get it. And he never did get it. The state of Minnesota kept the money, and the U of M never did pay him back. And every now and then I have my detractors who say, well, how important could the money have been to Minnesota anyway? We're not talking about the whole economy of Minnesota being dependent on it. Fair point. But it's not totally unimportant. I mean, you don't go out of your way to make laws to compromise your freeness if it's not important. You don't make a law that specifically says you people can't get your money back if the money's not that important. So those are some of the tidbits that you can find in Slavery's Reach. I thank you for your attention, and I'll take whatever questions or comments you have.
Is Aitkin County named after the Aitkin that you were at the same spelling? Or is that the same?
It's not the same person. I don't know who the person is, but it's not William Aitkin. Yes.
Can you describe a little of how you conducted this research? I mean, how exhaustive must that have been, and where do you find this stuff? And what's it like when you discover those connections? I mean, it's a fascinating process.
Well, thank you. So I've heard people describe it as forensic, which it probably is. But what I would do once I decided that I would look at real estate deeds is I would go to county recorder offices, especially in counties by the Mississippi River. And since slavery didn't become illegal until 1865 across the country, and Minnesota became a territory and a state well before then, I knew that if I went to a county that was in existence before 1865 and I found the name of a Southerner in a deed, there was a good chance that Southerner might be a slaveholder. So I would go to a county recorder office. I would basically camp out there all day, and I would just flip through page by page. Wherever I saw someone as a Southerner, I'd write down that person's name, where in the South they were from, and just keep going. Then when I was done for the day, I would go home, go to Ancestry.com or some other database that had census records digitized, and I would go to the slave schedule. And if that Southerner was listed as a slaveholder in that state that was listed on that deed, then I knew I had a deed that was recording money going from a slaveholder to a Minnesotan, or vice versa. So Slavery's Reach is largely the culmination of the collection of those deeds and trying to flesh them out and figure out who was doing the buying and who was doing the selling and why.
Anyone in our Facebook Live questions? No? Any other questions here? Go ahead.
How hard was it? I know there's like a lot of obstacles trying to find records from so long ago. How hard was it to find the exact records that you want?
Well, I didn't go in doing the research with an idea that I would find as many deeds as I found. I was just hoping to find something. And I was pleasantly surprised to find the things that I found, like the U of M thing. I wasn't looking for that. I stumbled across that on accident because one of the people who was also serving in Congress with Henry Rice was James Orr, who was also from South Carolina. In fact, Orr and Aitkin went to Minnesota together in 1856. And sometimes I would find news articles covering the vacations that Southerners had in Minnesota. And it just so happened in this article that I found about Orr, it mentioned Aitkin and that Aitkin had just loaned money to the U of M. I was thinking, what? I mean, I had already read books like Ebony and Ivy that were tracing slavery in the Ivy League, but I wasn't expecting that to be in Minnesota, but there it was. So when I found that in the newspaper, then I had, excuse me, I had to go look at records of the U of M. And remarkably, the U of M has digitized its Board of Regents papers going all the way back. And in the Regents Report of 1863, it specifically says that $8,000 of this bond belonged to William Aitkin before the present rebellion, which implies that now that we're in a war, it's not his anymore. But there it was in print. I mean, they were just out in the open and unashamed about it. Like, yeah, we took that money because they're the enemy now.
Two comments.
Yes.
thanks for making me feel really uncomfortable. And with that, do you have books for sale tonight?
I did not bring any copies for sale, but the book is available through the Minnesota Historical Society Press
Right.
website.
I looked it up where it's available. I just thought, easy route out, I'll take everyone here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
I'm curious if you'll talk about your emotions in the process. I mean, it seems like you have a lot of satisfaction for the work that you did and your effort. But at the same time, like I hear you talk and my stomach goes, seriously, we were all down about the money that so many times the ethics were compromised. Like, did you ever find moments like that?
Well, fortunately, I was prepared for it because I've been doing my family tree research for a long time. And part of that research as an enslaved person, or as the descendant of enslaved people, is to find all sorts of things, the very uncomfortable things, disturbing things about people in your family. And I was able to use those techniques from genealogy toward researching for the book. For example, even though the slave schedules didn't have enslaved people recorded by name, wills did and probate court records did. So if I knew people in my family who had been enslaved by specific people, and I knew that those specific people had died before 1865, my ancestors would be listed among their property. So I've been able to find all sorts of court documents listing all the inventory that's about to go up for auction. And, there's my great-great-great-grandfather, William, who's listed at worth $850 at 16 years old in 1836. And then I found all sorts of documents like that where there is a price tag next to a human being. And it is powerful when you realize that you have the blood of that human being in you. So again, it's really, I think, to my advantage that I didn't know about the family connection I had when I was writing this book. It would have been a completely different book. Yes.
So for my family, we kind of hit all spectrums because we have family and history of slavery, we have family and history of free people, we have family and history of natives.
Mm-hmm.
So we have all that. So in your research, when you found out about Fort Snelling, because a lot of people don't understand that when slavery was happening, there were indentured servants, as well as the indentured servants, there were natives that were taken captive as well, and they were enslaved with the African slaves. So when you were doing your research about Fort Snelling, did Seth Eastman come up at all?
Not very much. And that's my own shortcoming because I didn't focus on the military officers because I didn't have my own original research about that. Paul Bachman had done the bulk of it. So there wasn't a whole lot that I could add to that particular story. I just basically focused on the real estate deeds that I found because that was the new ground. That was the original turf. And really, the information about Fort Snelling was something that my editor encouraged me to include because I was so focused on the deeds. And the press said, well, you really have to talk about how it begins with the fort. So I looked at Bachman's book. I tried to find new approaches, and the best I could come up with was looking at the ties between the fort and the people who owned American fur. So If Eastman's name doesn't come up, then that's probably why. You have a personal connection to Eastman?
Eastman is like a lot of things that Americans sweep under the rug. Because I had this conversation with one of my coworkers because she felt comfortable enough to ask me about reparations and what I thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like it's reparations. I feel like it's a test to
Mhm.
balance this old.
Sure.
So I feel like as an American that is brown, it is my job to educate if you don't know.
Right.
So that's basically what I did. But in the end, she kind of figured out why it's old and now why it's not a reparation.
Mhm.
So basically, I kind of told her that it hasn't really stopped. It has gone into waves, and there is different sentiments of it. It comes from kidnapping to slavery to rape to being malnourished, all the way down to being emancipated, to the black lining, to the red lining, to okay, now because first black lining is actually where certain cities and states actually made areas where black people could not go and they were not allowed to be there or rent or anything there. And then when that wasn't good enough, the housing authorities kind of were enlisted with the government to nationalize redlining, greenlining. I'm sure people are familiar with that. It's codes of where different neighborhoods are split up into. So when black people were able to finally, okay, so now that we're locked in this place, now we can buy these things, and they started to buy and have ownership of things. Then it became, hey, we're gonna make this highway. So then they started to tear everything that we worked hard for. And they started to tear that away, and then we didn't get any compensation from that. But what people don't realize is that there's always, even though we've had the stigmatism of being less than people and savage, we've always been welcoming and open. And that's what we did. And so there's always been sprinkles of white people in neighborhoods that they are black people. And most of the time, those white people are Irish. I'm just gonna be honest. And not until those white people start to complain that the federal government say, okay, well, we gotta at least offer something for people property if we wanna develop on it. That's the only reason why that law was in place. But anyways, we started talking because I told them that things that are dehumanized or not right and don't feel right to you inside, whatever you feel like, you disassociate it with things. For example, with a cow, if it's alive, it's a cow. But when it's on my plate, it's a steak. We disconnect things. The same as with the Holocaust. That was 7 years. It doesn't negate the fact that they went through a lot. However, Americans are more sentimental to that because we didn't do it. And we sent troops. But when it comes to American slavery, and it was here for hundreds of years, and then there's waves of things that is still happening currently, we disassociate. Oh, it's not that bad. Because we don't want to take accountability of the things that we did. We did those things. Everything is still economical. Just like I told my friend, I said, I've been in situations where I've been at a bank and I have a better credit score. And then I'll see someone else, and I like to call them my light-skinned cousins, because you all are my cousins. And I have cousins that I don't like, you have cousins that you don't like. That's fine. However, I can go in a bank, I have a better credit score, I have a better situation. But two white people that came from the trailer park up the street, my credit score is better than theirs together, we'll get that loan before I do. That's still a reality. Minnesota is ranked one of the worst places to live for a person like myself. I live in Wisconsin, I live in River Falls. This is not a good place for us to live either. We were the black people here for a long time. It just started to be more minorities to come in. I've had sittings with the Jamie Benson and all of that. It's a lot of education that needs to be done, and a lot of accountability that everyone needs to take accountability for. I'm sorry.
No, I think that's really part of the point tonight here is to start a conversation. And I do want to ask, because you were talking about reparation, that's obviously something that's part of our conversation in the world today. When I've heard the word reparations, I've often wondered, how would that work? How would you begin to make that work? And the more I read into your book, the more I wondered, how would that work? It's so pervasive. How would it work? So what I wanted to ask you, our time is really running out, but I want to ask you, what do you think of reparation? What are your thoughts on that? How would you think it would ever pan out? What's the equation? What's the formula?
Mhm. Well, I sort of have a Maya Angelou approach to it. She is often quoted as having said, when you know better, you do better. And to me, reparations looks like all American citizens having an awareness of slavery being fundamental to this country's legal system and to this country's economy. And for residents of different communities in America to know that slavery was fundamental to the development of their communities. And when you have an awareness of that and an awareness of the baggage that comes with slavery, not just the money and the wealth that the enslavers made, but the violence and the family separations, among other things, that the enslaved people experienced, then it would be my hope that people who have this awareness would not want the inequality that slavery bred to be perpetuated. So reparations to me means, because you're aware of slavery, you're in favor of passing this law so that all people can vote, or that all people can live where they want to live, or anything that doesn't have to do with denying someone something, or at least perpetuating that denial or perpetuating the legacy of that denial. So, and even that's just really hard for people who read my book sometimes. But what I try to tell people with the book is that this story is an American story. If you are living in America in 1865, you are going to be touched by slavery. I don't care how far to the north you are. So what I try to do with Slavery's Reach was just to find out how Minnesota was especially touched. And again, the real estate deeds were the most concrete proof that I could find. So this is an American story. All of us as Minnesotans, as horrific as what I talked about was, at least you know that you're part of something that America did. You're not left out just because you're a Minnesotan or you're a, what's the word, Wisconsinite? Is that it? Okay. Because Wisconsin, didn't you all become a state in 1836? Is that correct?
It was
48?
48, 10 years earlier than
Thank you.
Minnesota.
So 1848. So you had a whole 10 years of statehood ahead of Minnesota. So that was 17 years that you were a state when slavery was still legal in this country. So if you wanted to go to real estate offices or recorder offices and look through deeds between 1848 and 1865 and look for Southerners, you might find slaveholders there too. Minnesota's not unique in this. I found news reports of people taking trips to Minnesota saying that they were on their way to Iowa to invest. So this is a very American story. It's not as perhaps exciting a story about slavery as talk about the Underground Railroad, but it's a story nonetheless. And as Northerners, it's our story.
Thank you, Dr. Lehman, for being here tonight, and thank you to the audience for being part of the conversation and everyone at home. I found your book fascinating, and I'm really pleased to meet you tonight. I want to just mention before closing that our next program is part 2 of a 4-part series on environmental sustainability. The title of that particular program is called Environmental, Social, and Governance Investing, and that is Thursday, February 24th at 6 p.m. here at the library, and it will also be available through Facebook Live and recorded for later viewing on our YouTube channel. Thank you, everybody.